Hello everyone, and welcome back to Inside ArtScroll, where the books you read and the people who write them come to life. Today we are privileged to be joined by the one and only Rabbi Paysach Krohn, the author of many ArtScroll volumes. Thank you for being here. I'm excited to talk to you, and we'll get right into it.
It's an honor to be here. I love ArtScroll. I always loved it from the time they were on Coney Island Avenue. I just would hang around there as much as I could. The people are just the most wonderful, dedicated people to Klal Yisrael, and I'm so proud to be part of it.
ArtScroll's proud to have you as part of the family.
Thank you.
And I was going to say that your name has become synonymous with ArtScroll. I believe your first book on Bris Milah was published in 1985, 35 years ago, with ArtScroll. And we actually have a lineup here, thanks to our wonderful friends in the ArtScroll warehouse. They were able to pull out all your books for us and line it up here so beautifully. And I have your first book here, Bris Milah. And the thing that jumped out at me was looking through it, and we could show the viewers how similar, almost exact, the text layout is today to what we're looking at from 35 years ago. With all the advances of printing and design, Reb Shia Brander, the genius of design, created something that has sustained. Could you comment on that? Just the fact that, look at the fonts, the pagination is virtually identical to what we see today. Isn't that unbelievable?
One of the things that always impressed me with Reb Meir Zlotowitz and Reb Nosson Sherman, and then eventually when I got to know Reb Shia Brander, is their tremendous professionalism. Everything that they did always had to be in such a way, not only that it was artistically beautiful, but that it made a Kiddush Shem Shemayim. It made Yiddishkeit look good. And I could never forget when that first Sefer came out on Megillas Esther in 1976. It was so incredible because, first of all, you had an articulate person who wrote the overview, and that was Reb Nosson Sherman. And then the commentary was brilliant. And the way Shia Brander put it together, that cover became like a standard. It was so beautifully, artistically done, and they followed that pattern since then. And all the books are like that.
It is incredible, and I want to share something that I don't know if people know. I actually just heard it recently. I met Reb Avi Shulman at a simcha, and he told me, number one, that he was the one who made the shidduch between Reb Meir Zlotowitz and Reb Nosson Sherman,
wow,
which I did not know. But then he added something fascinating. You have said over the story probably dozens of times about how Reb Meir dedicated himself to writing a commentary on Megillas Esther, Lila Nishmas, Reb Meir Fogel. Reb Avi told me that when the manuscript was finished and Reb Meir was looking for a publisher, he went around to various publishing houses, including Feldheim, and all the publishing houses turned him down. They felt that it was nice, but it wouldn't sell. That was the way he described it. And I was thinking to myself, could you imagine at the time? I'm sure it was to his utter disappointment that no one would take the book. I'm sure he was devastated. He worked so hard on the manuscript, no one wants to publish it. But could you imagine if one of those publishing houses did publish it? I don't know what would have happened with the next volume. Maybe they would have published that as well. And who knows if ArtScroll would have materialized. What a lesson in hashgacha and in responding to seeming adversity by understanding that obviously everything is min hashamayim. I just thought, what an eye-opener.
Well, I'll tell you something. You've hit on a very, very delicate point. Just last night, I gave one of the most difficult drushes that I ever gave. Now, there was a fellow, his name is Rav Moshe Morgenstern. He lost a daughter, Razi, or Razi's Chassidish fellow, that's what he called his daughter, 5 years ago in an accident in Arizona. And he was absolutely devastated. And I remember speaking to him and telling him that he should start a support group for fathers who lost a child. And it took a long time. Now, I've spoken for women who have lost children. It's a wonderful organization called Tapestry. And eventually, Moshe Morgenstern started this organization. And I spoke for them last night. And just this point that you're talking about is something that I said. when my father, Oliver Shalom, was very sick, and my brother, Rabbi Kalman, and I were in Washington Heights, Rav Schwab, I will never forget. We went to the hospital to visit my father, and I came back to eat the Suda with Rav Schwab and his Rebbitzin, and he said, how's your father? And I said, I have betachon that he'll be well. And he got so stern with me, and he said, betachon does not mean that your father's going to get well. I mean, I was terrified when he told it to me. I was all of 21. He said, betachon means that Hashem has a master plan, and maybe one day you'll understand it. Mm-hmm. But difficult things happen in life, and sometimes we get to understand it. And that which you just said about Reb Meir Zlotowitz is a perfect example. I'm sure he was devastated because he was a good writer, and he had this manuscript ready, and he probably figured, how could people not see that it's such a wonderful thing? And yet, because he was devastated, and then he had to go out and start his own, look what it's accomplished. Thousands of volumes. Changed Klal Yisrael. Changed Klal Yisrael, the way they daven, the way they learn, Gemara, and Chumash, and Medrash, and everything, every aspect of Yiddishkeit. It was all because he was rejected in a sense. So sometimes a person goes through a difficult time and can't understand, why is Hashem making this happen? And Meir was able to live to see why it happened, because he changed the world.
Just recently, I was sitting in Reb Gedalia Zlotowitz's office with another visitor, and we saw on a high shelf small but thick loose leaves. And we asked him what that is, and Reb Gedalia said, those are my father's writings, the original writings of Megillas Esther and then the subsequent Megillas.
Right.
And he pulled them down, and we looked through them.
Yeah.
Painstakingly written in longhand.
Yeah.
And it was just an insight, first of all, into his brilliance. You see, the original writing, before it was edited, he wrote like a poet beautifully. First of all, his handwriting is beautiful.
Right.
And you see the depth of his understanding, his Havana. He was a tremendous Talmud Chacham. And it really gave me an extra appreciation of who Reb Meir was and what his accomplishment is and how it's really everlasting and lives on. And he's given us all an opportunity to be educated and to learn, and people like yourself an opportunity to use your unbelievable talent.
Well,
to reach
I tell you, it's just so incredible. I'm so indebted, my whole family is so indebted to Reb Meir, Reb Nosson, and Reb Shia. I will never forget how it happened, actually. You know, I knew Reb Meir from camp.
Oh, yeah.
You know, he was an artist in camp. He was in Camp Aguda.
In Camp Aguda?
Right, and of course he made the banners. Nobody made a banner. You know, he was the greatest artist of all. And so I knew him as an artist, you know, as a lefty artist. You know, he was a lefty, and that's where I knew him from. That's where I knew Meir Fogel, the one he dedicated Megillas Esther to. And I remember when ArtScroll came out with Megillas Esther, I was fascinated by it. Now, at that time, I was going to a shiur called LICOR, Long Island Commission of Rabbis. Rabbi David Cohen was the Rav, and he gave the shiur to the Rabbanim in Long Island. And he spoke about this sefer that had just come out. And I always loved writing as a child because I learned it from my mother. You know, we would talk about writing, and she gave me the love of writing.
When we should mention, we have one of the books here.
The Way It Was.
I believe The Way It Was written by your mother.
My mother, right.
Hindi, right? Hindi Krohn.
Right, and that's one of the things we're so proud of. I think we're the only family that has 3 generations of writers for ArtScroll. My mother, Allah Shalom, and you know, she wrote The Way It Was. And of course, myself, Baruch Hashem, and my daughter, Baruch Hashem, Chaviva Krohn Pfeiffer, who's written a couple of the children's books. But getting back to what I was telling you was that when this Megillas Esther came out, I thought, wow, you know, there's a place for Jewish people to write something good. You know, when I was growing up, there was not that much Jewish writing. I wrote some stories for Olamenu, and you know, the way the war was won, I made up a story and it was printed.
What year was that you were writing for Olamenu?
It was shortly after high school, so I must have been about, I graduated in 62, so maybe 68 or maybe 70 or whatever.
But there weren't that many platforms for someone who wanted to write and get a message out there.
And then Rabbi Nissan Walpin was just so wonderful to me. He was so special. Every time he saw me, he wouldn't even say Shalom Aleichem. Just give me a pen. You know, he was great. And I wrote a few articles in the Jewish Observer. And one of the things I'll never forget, it just happened to be that in one of the Jewish Observers, I was published right before my article was Rab Nosson Sherman's article. And I was so happy to be close to him. I didn't really know him. I knew that he was the Menayel of Torah Tamima, or, and he was a Rebbe in Stolen, or he was the Menayel in Stolen as well. And so I was so proud that my article was next to him. Who would ever believe that? And then I remember one time, I always learned with Rabbi David Cohen, which I still learn with him today. Baruch Hashem, we learn once a week. And I met Meir Zlotowitz in the driveway. He was visiting Rabbi David. He loves Rabbi David.
Sure.
And Rabbi David was, in a sense, his Rebbe and his guidepost and his mentor. And I said to Rabbi Meir, I'd love to write for you. He said, well, you could write anything you want and we'll edit it. You just write it. So I said, well, can I do Kehelas? Because, they had just done Megillas Esther, and then I think Eichel came out, and Rus. And he said, no, the 5 Megillas we're doing ourselves. So I said, okay, so let me think about something. So I thought about Mishlei. That would be a good idea. So it's probably the dumbest thing I ever thought of, and I'll tell you why. So I never forget. I went to the 42nd Street Library. I don't tell this too often. And I got about 10 Svarim, there, Svarim on the Mishlei, and then I bought a few Svarim. And I knew I can't start in the beginning. Let me start right in the middle. I started with Perek Yud Aleph. And I figured, I'll start writing commentary, and, they'll edit it. And then I saw this is impossible. Because Mishlei, every word, every sentence, every pasuk is a book by itself. Sure. There's no storyline. So what am I going to write? 400 books? Like Mishlei has got so many psukim, and each one is a different concept. And it's obviously Shlomo HaMelech wrote it, so it's tremendous. So I had written a couple psukim, and I saw it's going to take over my life. It's impossible. So I was devastated, because I really wanted to write for ArtScroll. They were doing well, and people were beginning to compliment them and say what they were accomplishing for Klal Yisrael. So then they wrote on Kriya Shema, little pamphlet. Then they wrote on Kaddish. And I figured, oh my goodness, they're writing on topics. I've got a great topic to write on. I'll write on Bris Milah. Yeah, nobody could do it better than me. I was a male already a couple years, and I knew the Ashkenazic customs, the Sephardic customs, about babies being yellow, and, about names and all the minhagim. That would be great. So I called Meir Zlotowitz back because, he knew that I was starting Mishlei, and then it just didn't work out. So he said, okay, why don't you write a chapter? And Rab Nosson and I will look at it, and we'll see if it's worth writing. We'll do it. I said, okay, fine, but don't let anybody else do it, please. Just give me the opportunity. And I went home and I said to my mother, Mom, we got to write something. We got to do this. Because, for me as a male, that I wrote a book for ArtScroll on Bris Milah, that would be the greatest advertisement, right? So we decided that we're going to write a commentary on the Tfilos. I figured, there's a text there, there's something. I don't have to start,
the
from
Tfilos of Bris Milah.
The Tfilos on Bris Milah, and I'll write a commentary on it, and let's see how it goes. And so we worked on it. We took the Tfilos, and I translated them, and I found commentary in different Svarim, and I presented it. And Rab Nosson, I'll never forget this. Rab Nosson, I'm going to try not to cry. Rab Nosson and Rab Meir, they were on Coney Island Avenue, and I was waiting, for them to get back to me, and they said it's good. We have, I think we could do something.
Green light.
The green light, and 2 things happened. I came to the office, and I said, "Do I have a deadline?" And I'll never forget what Meir Zlotowitz said. You have no deadline, but I want you to keep this in mind as you're writing the book. You have to write the type of book so that nobody in their right mind in the next 10 years is going to write a book in English on Bris Milah. Wow. In other words, it has to be so all-encompassing that you've got to cover everything. That's the deadline. We're not worried about the time. Just make sure that it's all-encompassing.
Were you intimidated by that?
No, I was thrilled because I felt that I could do it because I had experience as a male. I knew what had to be in the book. And then the thing that was so touching to me, of course, today nobody has telephone books anymore, right? But Nosson Sherman had a little telephone book in his pocket, and he took out the telephone book, and he wrote my name in his book with my telephone number. And then he put it, I like I always say, next to his heart. And he said, now you're one of us. That I should be one of them was just so special. I'll never forget that little gesture.
Sure.
You know, I'm one of them.
Because you were an aspiring writer.
Yeah.
And that just made you feel
that
validated you.
Yeah, validated. Exactly. That's the right word.
Wonderful.
And then, of course, you know, I spent a tremendous amount of time. My favorite part was writing on names, because as a male, many times I help people give a Hebrew name, especially I do many bris and phenom from people, and they're always looking for names. You know, they'll have the English name, you know, Justin or Brian or whatever, and they don't know what to use for the Hebrew name.
I've heard you say that you actually keep a log of
every single bris. Oh, of course.
You've performed with the name of the child.
Oh, of course.
And what was your motivation to do that?
I'll tell you what, because my father also did that, and the reason that he did it and the reason I did it just happened just the other day. I got a call from somebody that I did a bris, it was about 12 years ago. The kid's going to have a bar mitzvah. They forgot what they named him in Hebrew.
Wow.
And I always give a certificate. In the back of the bris milah book, there's also a certificate, and then has the Hebrew name. And they just didn't remember the name. Wow. It wasn't really so connected to the boy's English name. That's why they didn't remember it. But I had the record. In a second, I just went downstairs and got it out, you know, and told it to them.
Wow.
I mean,
now, how long did it take you to put together the bris milah book?
So that took about 2.5 years, because I wanted to make it not only the minhagim, and not only the tefillos and the extra tefillos, you know, that there are in benching, and I wanted to talk about certain topics. Names was one of them. The significance of 8. 8 is very important in Yiddishkeit. There's 8 strands on tzitzis. There's 8 big day kahuna, and there's 8 generations from Avram until they went out of Mitzrayim.
8 is l'mayla min hateva.
Exactly, right, from the moral.
Right.
And so therefore I figured I would write about that. And then I wrote about the Sandik. And in general, I wanted to make some very strong essays. And somebody who was fabulous in the translation of the Tefillos was Avi Gold.
Sure.
Avi Gold worked for
ArtScroll
for
legend,
many,
yeah.
Really. He was just absolutely incredible. And he could put together the Tefillos and the translation. He was absolutely amazing. And I'll tell you something very interesting. I don't tell this often, but it just shows, you know, what I felt about what they are. I remember one time I had a certain problem. I forgot what it was. And I went to Reb Nosson Sherman, you know, in his office in Coney Island Avenue. And I asked him for a bracha. And he said, why are you coming to me? I mean, there's so many chashav rabbanim that you could go to. I said, Reb Nosson, is there anybody else who is Marbitz Torah like you? I mean, think about it. It's all over the world. There's no greater Harbatzes Torah than you in ArtScroll. So of course you have more schusim than anybody, and that's how I looked at it. And this was even before the Shas. So it's humbling to be part of them, and I'll never forget they started in '76, and then they had their 10th year anniversary. I remember Rab Giftal Shalom was one of the guest speakers, and I was invited to that dinner that they had. It was fabulous to sit among those Heilige people that just changed the way, as I said before, the way people davened, the way people learned. It's all ArtScroll.
What was it like for you back in 1985 when you first held your book that you pined for so long?
I'll tell you.
And you were finally holding it. What was that like?
You will not believe. I'll never forget. It was in Meir's Lot. It was his kitchen. And I came on a Friday, Erev Shabbos, and he told me that he had the book. And I had worked on it 2.5 years. Now, I had never seen a book that I published because this was the first book, right? So I'm waiting for this thick book, right? This thick hardcover. And he gives me a soft cover that was so thin, I thought I would faint. I said, did you print everything that I wrote? He said, it's all here. I said, I can't believe, how could it be all here? Look at this. And I felt, oy vey, this looks like nothing. You know, it was a thin paperback book. But of course it was all in there. You know, the hardcover made it look a little better. But
right.
But I'll never forget then what I did was, at that time, in the beginning, I had many soft cover editions printed, and I would give it out at every bris. And then a couple days later, after the bris, the people would call me and say, you know, we wish we had this before. It was so good. So then I started a new thing. Then I had UPS come to my house every single day, And the moment I got a call, it's still Adayam Azeh. The day I get a call,
Really?
I fill out a UPS label and send them a book. And like this, they can read it, a couple days before. And there's a tremendous amount of information in there.
After completing the Bris Milah book, what prompted you to go the story route and start writing up stories?
Well, I'll tell you, I really feel that I owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to a dear friend of mine, Hanoch Teller. Hanoch is a brilliant writer. And in Eretz Yisrael, I think it was at the end of the 80s, or right around that time when the Bris Milah book had come out, so shortly after 1985, there was a contest in Eretz Yisrael for writers to write about Yerushalayim. And he, among, I'm sure, must have been 1,000 writers, put a piece together about the significance of Yerushalayim and the history of Yerushalayim, and he won the contest. And I know that it was printed. I was very impressed with the way he wrote. And then shortly afterwards, he wrote his first book of stories, and I think it was called Souled, S-O-U-L-E-D. And then I began thinking, hey, wait a second. This guy's writing stories. I have access to stories that nobody has, because I was very close to Rabbi Krohn. My brothers Colin and Arya were even closer than I was at that time. And, the American public, certainly the young generation, didn't know Yiddish, they didn't know Hebrew, and he had such great stories with such wonderful lessons. And I thought, that would be a great idea. So I called him, and I said, that maybe we should write your stories in English, and it would be for the public. And I told him about ArtScroll. And he said, yeah, that would be a great idea. And he wanted that I should get started right away. But I couldn't do it right away because I was still involved in the Bris Milah book. I couldn't have my head involved in 2 books at one time. It was just too much. And then the Siddur was coming out just at that time. And of course, they had 100,000 orders in advance before the Siddur even hit the market. And you can understand that there cannot even be one tiny mistake in a Siddur. We're not talking about a Maggid book that you made a mistake, so fine, the next time you respell the word or whatever. I mean, you're talking to Hashem. You can't mix up a segel and a tzereh or a kametz and a pasach. So they had to do it over and over and over till it was absolutely perfect. But that delayed the publication of the Bris Milah book. And so, between me and you and the 100,000 people that are going to watch this, he got somebody else to start writing the stories.
Really?
Yeah, I was devastated.
That must have hurt.
Oh, I was devastated. Because I gave him the idea. But, he felt it had to be done. But, sometimes somebody's mistake is your advantage. And what that fellow did was he was translating literally from Rab Shalom's Yiddish to English, and you can't do that. You can't translate one language to the other. You got to get the flow of what it was. And so by the time he realized that, because people were telling him, listen, it's not readable in English. So then I started writing. And I had a cousin who's Nebuchadnezzar in the Olam Emes Chaim David Ackerman, who learned in Hebron Yeshiva. And what he did was that he took the stories that I sent him in English, and he sat with Rab Shalom and he translated them in Yiddish for Rab Shalom.
Is that for the veracity, to make sure that they were correct?
Yes, right, to make sure that it was correct. And Rab Shalom started writing me notes on the stories,
Wow.
how I wrote them, whether he liked it or not. And then, I guess his hand was hurting because he was just writing on every single story, and my goal was to have about 95, 100 stories. And then he would tell me, oh, just I say good ogetaich the Maisa, like it was so beautiful how you teach this Maisa. And then he would say, was bist du Meshuga? Das hast du ausgelernt von dem Maisa? It has a different meaning altogether. So because of that, a certain element happened in the Maggid books that I've carried it till this day, and that is, the story is in one font. Because the first book, that was only his stories, so the story was all his, but the lesson from it was in a different font and in an indented chapter, indented paragraph, I should say, and that was my lesson from it. And he went along with that because like this, the story remains the story. Whatever anybody wants to learn from it, that's fine. The way you learn it, and you understand it, that's in a different typeface.
So it was clear that the lesson was yours and he gave you the liberty of doing it.
Exactly. And that's how I carried it in every book. Even the stories that were not from him. And all the other subsequent books, I let the story stand for itself, and then the lesson that I learned from it. And, the Gemara says that, Kezera Gad Lovan, that the man was like a white coriander seed, but the Gezerah, God comes from the word magid. And so a story is like the mun. The mun could be different things to different people, had a different taste. And that's how I teach the Gemara. A story can have different flavor to different people. So I write the story, and you learn what you like from it, but I'm going to tell you what I learned from it. You could agree with me, or you could not agree. That's your prerogative. But in that way, it's like mun. And, then it worked. And what happened was, after the Maggid Speaks came out, and that really took off. No, because ArtScroll had never printed a book on stories, and that was selling left and right. And I figured that's it. I got all of Rabbi Shalom's stories, what there is. When one time I was in ArtScroll, and Nosson Sherman says to me, you got to write again. I said, what should I write? He said, listen to me. He said, I just got back from South Africa, and the Rebbe was reading from your book to the Talmidim. He says, you know how far South Africa is from here? Thousands and thousands of miles. And your stories are having effect on children in South Africa. I had never been to South Africa before. Since then, I've been there many times. I love going there. But he said, if those Rebbeim in South Africa are teaching the kids from your story, you got to find stories. I said, where am I going to find them? He said, go back to Rabbi Shalom. I said, I got most of his good stories already. He said, well, then you're going to have to find others. And that's what happened. The first book was The Maggid Speaks, because it was only him. And then the second book was Around the Maggid's Table, because when you're sitting around the Maggid's table, the Maggid tells some stories, and other people tell stories. And that's what happened. I got some more stories from Rabbi Shalom, but basically I started asking different Rabbonim, and I started asking Askonim, and I started asking people about stories, and I started writing them down. And that's why the second one was called Around the Maggid's Table. And it still had Rabbi Shalom's picture on the second book, because many of the stories were from him. But the idea was that that's how it started going. And once I started asking people for stories, people would stop me in the street and tell me a story. And, they wanted to know if I know how to spell their name, because they wanted to be printed. But, and then, every time I've written a book, I figured, okay, that's the end. There's nothing else it can be. But Baruch Hashem, it's been going on.
And what's interesting is that your first book on stories is called The Maggid Speaks.
Right.
And the Maggid was referring to Reb Shalom Shvadron.
Yes, right.
What happened over time is that you became known as the Maggid.
And I tell you, that was very embarrassing for me, because, I felt that that's an exalted title. I didn't want to take that on myself. And that's why every book, it's the illuminations of the Maggid, the original Maggid, reflections of the Maggid, the original Maggid, the splendor of the Maggid. Because I don't think I've ever called myself the Maggid. I know many, many people refer to it. I remember Rabbi Brafman, Olav Shalom. He was the first one who introduced me that way. I still remember Shalosh Shudas in Yeshiva Farakoi when he mentioned that. I was like so enamored and so thrilled and humbled, that I should be called that. But I'll tell you a little secret. When Abshalom was here the first time, and my father was alive at that time, I was so amazed at what he could do with an audience. He could make them cry, he could make them laugh, and he moved them so. And I said to my father, it's hard to believe, but I said to my father, I said, Pa, is it possible to be a Maggid in America? And my father said, in America, you could become whatever you want to become. Now, when I was 18, 19, I was not thinking of becoming a Maggid. But just the fact that he told me that you could become anything that you want,
Wow.
that was liberating.
But I will say that I think the reason why you became known as the Maggid is because of your unbelievable oratory skills. So you started off writing,
Right.
but it was the ability, like you said, to connect to an audience,
Right.
and to articulate in a way
Yeah.
that resonates and that
Yeah.
penetrates and that's compelling.
Yeah.
And that leads me to my next question. At what point did you know that besides for being able to convey messages via the written word, that you'd be able to do it orally by being an orator? When
Well,
did that
I'll
happen?
tell you how that happened. It's very interesting, because many, many people, when they see a book, they think, well, if the fellow can write a story, maybe he could tell a story. Now, in camp, of course, I was a counselor and I was a learning Rebbe, so I had some oratory practice, so to speak. I was a color war general, and I always loved, speaking. I'm pircha leader and things like that, but never, on a broad scale in the family. I always spoke at Sheva Brachas. But I'll never forget Rabbi Baruch Grossman. Actually, I was his counselor in camp. He was known as Barry Grossman, but today Rabbi Baruch. And he called me to speak at a graduation. He was running a Russian school. And the book had just come out in March, I think it was, or I think so. That's when the first Maggid book came out. And he called me for a graduation in June. And it started from there. Now, of course, in the beginning, you don't speak at the Aguda Convention, or at Sinai and Daba in South Africa, or in Kinloss in England, for 1,000 people. But, it slowly builds. And once I began speaking and began to hone the speaking skills, how to make it presentable, how to make it orderly, and then to review. I'll never forget the first time that I had spoken together with Rebbetzin Zahava Bronstein, Allah Shalom. She was such a tzaddikis. And I reviewed at the end of the speech, as I always do. She said to me, that's a great way of speaking. You must do that at every speech. And that became like a trademark that I always review. Right.
Reviewing.
I always review at the end. And there's a very important lesson there because it shows that there's a structure, that there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, and it just flows. And many, many people ask me, do you ever get nervous when you speak? And I always tell people the same thing. I never get nervous when I speak.
Really, why not?
I always get nervous when I prepare. When I'm preparing, I'm sweating bullets. I could sit at a table for 3 hours in a row. My wife says, what are you doing at the table 3 hours in a row? And I said, I'm thinking and I'm writing and I'm rewriting and putting the cards in order and figuring out what is going to make the audience listen and follow in such a way that they won't get lost. And that's I think that's part of it. So somebody just, one of Hananiah's friends, Shmuley Rosenberg, just told me yesterday. He said, you should have a course in teaching people how to speak publicly.
Sure.
So
I was going to ask you,
Yeah.
growing up, were there any speakers who you aspired to emulate?
That's a great question.
And whose style maybe you incorporated into your own
I'll tell you some of the great speakers that I loved. John Kennedy is a fabulous speaker. Abba Eban, oh, what a speaker. I think I heard the speech that he gave in the UN after the Six-Day War. I think I've heard it 30 times. I loved that speech. It was fabulous. He didn't mention Hashem's name in there. That hurt me. He was an Israeli guy. How could you not say Hashem's name? That it was a miracle, the Six-Day War, but for whatever reason, But Rabbi Jacobowitz, Emmanuel Jacobowitz, the eloquence of this man, Rabbi Gifter, Rabbi Schwab, these people who spoke, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. Rabbi Yaakov wasn't an orator, but the emes and the seichel hayashar of these people when they got up to speak. Rabbi Gifter was, of course, very powerful.
So what makes a master orator? Is it the content? Is it the mastery of the language? Is it the cadence? Is it the energy? I mean,
it's all those things
today
that
we're inundated with so many
right,
different
so
speakers.
Right.
Everyone has their own style.
Right,
what do
right.
you, as the master speaker, what do you think it is?
I think that what you just touched on, it's all those things. First of all, the audience has to feel that you respect them. That's the first thing. I always wear cufflinks when I speak. Always, always, always. I mean, even on Zoom, I would never do a Zoom without a tie and a jacket. How do you speak to an audience without a tie and a jacket? So you respect them, you dress accordingly, and you never talk down to people, and you're always trying to build people. Tell people they're good, but they can be better. Don't tell people they're bad. Nobody wants to hear that they're bad. And many times the speaker, will try to show, he'll give them mussar, especially in Elul, tell them how awful they are, and they're going to burn a Gehenna, and that Rosh Hashanah is the Yom HaDin, and they better be afraid, of what they've done. It's not my style, So you have to build people. And I think that's one thing. You have to connect to the people and never, ever say anything that you don't believe in. And never, ever ask an audience to do something that you don't do. They'll see through it. They'll see through it. If you ask them, you want them to do certain things, whatever, to daven a certain part. I'm a very big believer in saying, Al tira after Olenu. I always say it. I would never ask people to say it. If I didn't do it, I tell people to say korbanos. There's certain things, to give tzedakah every day. There's a wonderful organization called dailygiving.org. I'm involved with that, but that's only I can ask people to do that because I do it. So I think that you have to have a powerful story and don't get bogged down with the details. If you went to Eretz Yisrael, nobody cares if you went to Air France or El Al or, Delta Airlines. That's not important, And you've got to get to the main points of the story and then relate to the story, to the lesson that you want to give. And it's true, you have to face your audience. I never, ever read a speech. Ever, don't ever read a speech. Never. Because then you
I've noticed
lose.
that.
Yeah, then
You
you
have
lose.
notes?
Yeah, I have notes. What I
Well-
want to say, general.
Have you ever used a teleprompter?
No,
So you're
never.
speaking extemporaneously.
Right, just like I'm
but
speaking
you
to you
have-
right now.
But you have
it's a
notes in front of you
conversation.
to give you structure.
Right, exactly.
Are you ever
exactly.
nervous that you may not have the right formulation of words and you may
Well,
kind of
sometimes if I want a keyword, I may write that down because
Okay.
I have it in my mind, you know what I want to say, so I'll write down that keyword. Another thing, I never, ever start with a joke. Many, many speakers start with
you
jokes.
say Milsa de Bediches,
Yeah,
they
but
want-
most of the jokes are not funny. And what happens is when the joke is not funny, you turn off half the audience. What did he think? What did this guy think? That I'm so stupid, that I think that's funny. It's not
well,
funny.
humor is tricky because
Yeah, right.
what some people find funny,
Right.
others don't. I always say
Right.
with a story and inspiration,
Yeah,
very often you'll find that common theme that will
Right.
inspire everyone.
right.
With a
But
joke,
with
it's
a
not
joke,
that
it's
way.
not there. There's only one joke, one speaker that I know that started with a joke that was the greatest joke that I ever heard in front of an audience. It was absolutely fabulous, and that was Rabbi Wine. There's nobody like him anyway.
Sure.
And he and I were was supposed to speak for the Nefesh organization many, many years ago. And I said to Mrs. London, who called us, I'm not speaking after him. I got to speak first because, this guy knows everything. What am I going to say? So I'll never forget, it was preparing for Geula. And I'm telling you, I prepared for that speech probably 2 months, at least 2-3 months. And I'm telling you, a week before the speech, I called Rabbi Wine. And I said, what are you going to say? Because I'm very well prepared. I don't want to say something if, you're going to say it. He said, well, I didn't even think about it yet. I'm preparing 2.5 months, and he's not even thinking about it, right? Okay. There were 1,000 people in Montauk High School in Borough Park that night. I'll never forget. And I'm telling you, I covered that topic from head to toe, preparing for Gula. He gets up, he said one sentence, and he had the whole audience in his back pocket that he continued the drasha. He said, and I can't imitate a Chicago accent, but he said, I learned a lesson in the rabbinate a long time ago. When the meal gets finished, there's very little left for the rabbi to do.
And that was it.
Oh, gosh. He had the audience screaming in laughter. And then he gave his speech. But unless you have a crack like that, don't start with a joke.
How many hours does it take you to prepare one speech, would you say?
Oh, it's days and days, really. You think about it all the time,
Because you're constantly compiling information.
Yeah,
And you probably have an archive
now, for
of
example,
stories,
yeah,
right?
well, that is true. But like, for example, right now, the last 10 years, Baruch Hashem, I've been going to, at least 10 years, to England and Elul.
Right.
I'm not going to go this year because of, they don't have, the main audiences are not getting together. And even it's a very big show, but there's 1,000 people that come. So you can't social distance. So we're going to do, Hanani is going to film a video, but it's a brand new topic. It's a great topic, but I have to think a lot about it, which I really have to get into. And that is, how are we going to daven this year Rosh Hashanah without our regular olam that gets us into the davening? And what if the regular chazan can't be there? And the regular chazan is the one who usually is ma'orah the olam to tefillah. So, you might not be in the regular shul that you're davening. You're not going to be with your crowd. You might not even be with your Baal Tefillah. How are you going to connect to Hashem on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? These are all givens. The Baal Tefillah is there, the Negunim are there, and the Oilam is there, but they're not. Wow, that's a tough speech to prepare. I really have to think about that. I don't have the answers yet, but we have to get them.
I've once noted a difference between, let's say, those who work in music and entertain and inspire, and those who write or speak. A singer, he could sing his hit song for 40 years and sing the same song again and again, and the crowd will love it.
Right.
A speaker cannot reuse his material, and especially in a world today where things are recorded.
It's so true.
What do you do?
I daven.
At one time, before recordings and before
Right.
videos, you could say a speech in one shul
Right.
and say it in another, and you're good to go.
It's
Till
true.
the story makes the rounds. Nowadays, your
Yeah.
material is
That's
only as
true.
good as the day you say it.
Well, it is true to a point, especially when it goes on TorahAnytime.com, which is
Sure.
one of the great organizations in Klal Yisrael. And that goes all over. And my wife many times tells me, don't give it to them. Don't tell them you're speaking, in Brooklyn, because they come and record it, and then you're stuck in Los Angeles. But my policy is, and I keep a record of every single speech, just like I keep a record of
For real?
every sure, of course,
So
every
every
single
speech
one.
you've ever given
Every single one.
with the
since-
topic and the content?
Yeah, sure. I could tell you. You tell me a speech that I gave in a date, I'll have it for you in 5 seconds.
Wow.
Yeah, it's not on computer. It's all written out, but whatever. Although now I have it on computer and I could find it, and so if I gave a speech in Los Angeles, I won't give that speech again. But if I gave it in Chicago, and they listened to it, I can't be blamed for that. So I may repeat in Los Angeles what I said in Chicago,
Right.
or I could say in South Africa, what I said in Switzerland. But in the same place, I would never repeat the same speech.
Now we're looking here, Kanai Nahara, all the books you've
Yeah.
produced. It's a real nachas. What do you see? What's your next step?
Well, I had a tremendous hatzlacha with the Haggadah. Now, people have been after me for years that I should write a Haggadah. And then 2 years ago, I decided, now's the time. And the way I decided to write the Haggadah was different than any Haggadah that was ever printed. In other words, I'm not going to write a commentary, because Baruch Hashem, there are thousands of Perushim on the Haggadah. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take every part, like Avodim Ayinu. Now, Avodim, you know what Avodim stands for? David ben Yishai Avdecha Meshichecha. So, in the first word of the answer that the Father gives, he's talking about Mashiach. That's the goal. It's amazing. Now, and so what I did was I took the theme of every piece, whether it was Chad Gadya or Echad Miyadeh or whatever, and wrote a story about something about the essence of that piece. So it wasn't a commentary on the piece, but somebody could read it. Now, and I worked very, very hard on it, and ArtScroll has the greatest editors in the world. Rabbi Sherman, who edits all my stuff, and I'll tell you a great story about that in a second. And Frumi Eisner, Mrs. Felice Eisner,
Sure.
they are fabulous. There's no editors like them in the world, and they've been doing the last number of books. And that I said to Rabbi Nassim, I said, why don't we publish a book of the way I gave you the story and the way you edited, and people will learn how to write. He says, I don't want to embarrass you. but he's masterful. It's just, there's no way. I love seeing what he does with the sentences and the structure. He's fabulous. So what happens is that I give in the stories, they edit it and they bring it back to me. They send it to me, and they're working very, very, very diligently. So now when the Haggadah came out, it was right before Purim, before COVID. Now, I'd worked very hard. I worked 1.5 years on it. And when COVID happened, I figured, that's it, finished. It's not going to sell. All the stores are closed. They was geholfen that ArtScroll moved to Rahway. And Governor Murphy allowed them to be open even when COVID started in New York. So they were able to sell thousands and thousands of Haggadahs, even though the stores were closed. People were calling and they were ordering them. And to me, one of the most rewarding things was that so many almanas, so many people told me that they were alone at the Seder, and they read the Haggadah till 2:30 in the morning. Wow. You can't imagine. So many almanas said to me, it was me, you, and Hashem. Wow. And we loved it. We read it both nights. One lady wrote me, she said, I never said Shia Shirim at a Seder before in my life. But you had it there, and you explained it. And I was alone, and I was up till 2:30 reading it. And it was so special. So Gedalia just couldn't get enough of the emails. I was getting all these emails, and I forwarded it to him. He said, you got to do something else. I said, what? So I had an idea, but of course, they always have better ideas. And he said to me, what you should write is on Elul, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. And do like a Haggadah, just like you did. Mm-hmm. Don't write a Perush on the Machzor. So the working title is the Maggid on the Machzor, but it's not going to be on the Machzor only. It's on Elul, it's on Tshuva, Tefillah, Tzedakah, all these wonderful stories that I've picked up in different places, many of them new, some of them from the Maggid books. And it's going to be on the different type, on Asan and Toikef, on Tshuva, Tefillah, and Tzedakah, on Kihinek HaChomer, all these things, the theme of them. And Rab Nosson is just masterful. Now, the story that I just gave in the other day, and Felice Eisner just gave it me back today, the final editing. I don't know if you know that in 1943 in Denmark, Hitler and Himmler, they wanted to finish off the Yidden. And they had planned that on the night of Rosh Hashanah, when all the Yidden were in shuls, they were going to round up with trucks around all the shuls, take the Yidden, get them on ships, and ship them to concentration camps. And there was one guy, his name was Duckwitz. He was a Nazi, but he was in the government in Denmark. And he was a German representative. He hated the Nazis. He hated their cruelty. And he decided he's going to, betray his country and tell the Jews that they got to get out. And that's what he did. He let the Jewish people know through the president of the Jewish Society, who let the rabbi know. And on the day of Slichas, 2 days before Rosh Hashanah, the Rav got up, Rabbi Melechor, and he said, Rabbi Paysach, we're not saying Slichas. I want you to go home right now, and I want you to run. Tell everybody they got to run up north, because this guy Duckwitz went to Sweden to try to convince the Swedish prime minister that the Jews would come over by boat, and he should take them. They should take them. And it's hard to believe. There are a few books about this, and I
was going to ask where the story is documented.
Yeah, so there's Mrs. Sharfstein, who I know in Crown Heights. She grew up in Stockholm. She wrote a book, It Was Morning, It Was Evening, or It Was Evening, It Was Morning. And Rabbi Bamberger wrote a book called The Viking Jews, and he has the whole story about it, how the Yidden ran. 6,000 Yidden was saved within 2 weeks, from before Rosh Hashanah until after Yom Kippur. And they stayed in Sweden, some for 19, some for 22 months. And what's shocking is when they came back, they went into their houses, everything was still on the table the way they set it for Rosh Hashanah. The bechers were there, the candelabras were there, the silverware was there. The Danes did not let anybody go into the Yiddish houses. That's how Rabbi Bamberger ends his book. It was just unbelievable.
So it is one of the stories that you're including in the volume.
Right.
And you hope to have this done for next
year
year's
Rosh Hashanah. Yeah, not this year Rosh Hashanah, yeah.
Do you foresee doing, then following it up with something on Hanukkah, Purim?
Who knows? I don't know.
Who knows?
I don't know. Maybe we'll do another Maggid Book of Stories. I don't know.
This is something that I've wanted to ask some of our guests. What, other than a Rabbi Krohn book, of course, or Chaviva's book, or your mother's book, what is your favorite book or two that you could think of that either impacted you or that you particularly enjoyed?
Not the ones that I wrote?
Not the ones that you wrote.
That's a good question. I have to think about that. What book? You know, there was a Rabbi Donin many years ago who wrote a book, To Be a Jew. That was fabulous. That made a big reshim on me. Trying to think. I mean, I've gotten all of Rav Schwab's books, selected speeches and things like that.
Now, of your books, anyone that in particular
was
special to
Traveling
you?
with the Maggid was the most difficult one to write. That was about our trip to Lithuania.
Right.
And that had to include the history and what went on the trip and the Divrei Torah of the Gedolim. So that was 3 books in one. Right. And it's a coffee table book. I was hoping to write something on Poland. Maybe one day I would do that. Then there's a book called The Glittering World of Chesed, which is fabulous ideas of Chesed of Klal Yisrael in different places all over the world. And of course, the Bris Milah book is something that I'm very proud of. You know, that was the first one. And Baruch Hashem, you know, it's I'm very, very gratified.
You've enriched us all. We love the stories.
I hope
My only question is whether you're a better writer than a speaker or a better speaker than a writer. But either
or a better
way,
mile than both of them. I just did Hananiah's grandson.
But
Yeah, just
that's
last
right.
week.
Mazel tov on Yinu Einikel.
Yeah, that's right.
And of course, we should mention that it's Hananiah who's the brilliance behind making us look good on the show. I mean, we sit, we talk, but someone's got to be behind the camera.
100%.
And Hananiah and his team at Kol Ram do a fabulous job. So we thank all of them. And we thank you for joining us today, for giving us some insight into what has become a tremendous career of inspiring chizuk, inspiring all of us to be better people, to be better Ovdei Hashem. And the Mitzvah Hashem, you should continue to use your considerable talents. Lahagdol Torah La'adira.
Amen. Amen. And I just want to encourage all the listeners that have your kids read a lot so that they can learn to write and they can learn to speak. Because today, with technology the way it is, you could be speaking here in New Jersey, in Rahway, New Jersey, and somebody in Chile, in Switzerland, is going to be inspired by it. And that's what Torah Anytime is all about. You know, you have speakers in Queens, but it goes all over the world. So if you know how to write and you know how to speak, you have such a possibility of reaching tens of thousands of people. That's why it is so important.
100%. I can tell you just from being here at ArtScroll, we see where orders go to. It's worth a visit just to the warehouse to see the addresses of where books and svarim and gemaras and sidurim and chumashim are going to, and it is inspiring that the written word has that power to go all over. And like you said,
well, that's
being
the
an orator as
ArtScroll,
well.
Motto: the written word is forever.
Exactly.
It really is.
So we thank you again.
And I thank Rabbi Paysach Krohn for the opportunities that he's given me, and Rab Nosson Yabad L'chaim, and Rab Shia, Eli Krohn. All these guys make me look good, believe me. It's not me. But Baruch Hashem, I'm so grateful.
We are fortunate, and thanks for enhancing the ArtScroll brand as you have.
Thank you so much.
Atzlachu bracha.
Okay, and atzlach on everything you do.
Thank you.